So we need to figure out how we can transform land use, how we can shift power, how we can reset culture, how we can break down silos to move a system in a different direction.
You're listening to the Transcendent Farmer Podcast with your host, Emily Reno. Hey there, Transcendent Farmers. So I've got a little bit of an interesting and unusual introduction to today's episode. I'm going to skip the script because I think it's kind of boring and I feel like it's important to mix things up. For those of you who have been along for the journey, you already know this, but for new listeners, I am going through a training program right now to become a professional interpreter for Spanish. This has been a long dream of mine, and I'm in Module 2 right now through Middlebury Institute's program. This is a 100% virtual program, and I've been really enjoying it. And one of the readings that we had for this week, which is focused on this concept called vicarious trauma, was quite interesting and fascinatingly connected to today's interview. So I wanted to highlight this idea because basically what they're talking about is that as an interpreter, I have to interpret in first person. So instead of saying they did XYZ, they did whatever, I have to say I, as if I were actually the person that I'm interpreting for. So what they talk about in some of our readings for this week is the experience that people had, what they're calling vicarious trauma, of all of these interpreters throughout the process of all of these trials in the aftermath of Rwandan genocide. For anyone that may recall, there was a movie in probably the early 2000s that was called Hotel Rwanda that specifically covers this. And honestly, to this day, like some of those images are scarred in my mind. So when this came up in our reading, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I know what they're talking about here. But essentially what they talk about is that a lot of these interpreters, they had different kinds of coping mechanisms to deal with the fact that they're talking about all of these things in first person on a daily basis. And eventually they start to get numb to what they're interpreting because they've been exposed to this kind of information so often, whether it's people having their limbs chopped up or having their heads cut off or these women having been raped, right? This is intense stuff. And even outside of that particular environment, if you're interpreting in a medical setting, it can be really intense. So what's fascinating about this reading is that I'm coming across it just a day after having read a particular passage in a book from Stephen Bartlett called Diary of a CEO. Now, in his book, which is subtitled The 33 Laws of Business and Life, he covers all of these different principles that will essentially help you, both obviously in business and in life, succeed. This particular law that I was reading about, Law 24, you must make pressure your privilege. It's interesting, but because what he does is he goes on to cite some people that he had interviewed as part of his podcasting efforts. And one of the things that he was looking at was this topic of stress, pressure, and its impact on our health. So he writes, this is on page 241. One of the most surprising reoccurring concerns I had presented to me can be summarized in something said to me by Gary Brecka, founder of 10X Health. We are living in a comfort crisis. We are slowly suffocating ourselves to death with comfort by avoiding the hard things that are good for our health. Aging is our aggressive pursuit of comfort. Okay, so what's the connection here? Because there may be people that are listening to this and they're like, what? I don't understand where you're going with this, Emily. Here's my thought. Are we actually experiencing an epidemic of comfort as a result and symptom of being overexposed to traumatic content? Because earlier in the chapter, they talk about this, how we as humans have become desensitized because we are constantly being exposed to images of disaster, of violence, floods, earthquakes, right? Terrorist attacks, plane crashes, boats filled with immigrants who are sinking, famine, destruction, mass killings, shooting, bombing. All of this stuff is happening, and we have become numb to it. So my thought is the comfort crisis actually a coping mechanism happening at a societal scale because of people's overexposure to all of these intense images And anyone who is on social media understands that the algorithms are built in a certain way. And we also know that anyone who has looked into the behavioral psychology behind headlines and how they are designed, the way that tabloids are created, and also the way that newspapers, any news outlets really, are designed to capture our attention. And what they found over time is that the more negative and shocking the information or the tagline, the faster it will capture people's attention. Unfortunately, because we are driven to make these decisions based on data and engagement, we continue to amplify these negative messages. In a way, it has this effect of shifting our perception around how much crime is happening in our society in comparison to how much is actually occurring. This is one of the things that I have taken away from my international travels that I find most fascinating, is that there are so many more people that are living in fear than those who are not. And I would say that because of how many people have looked at my own actions and they're incredulous, or they look at me and they're like, wow, how could you even do that? Is it even safe there? Because of the way that these messages are controlling the narrative about what is happening in a place. So this brings me to today's episode and the interview that I had with Matt, because one of the things that you will hear him talk about is this concept of power and control and the systems that are around us. And I would really like you to ask yourself this question of, what are the elements of the environment that I'm currently operating in that I have control over? And which of those elements do I not have control over? I'm hopeful that that exercise will bring light to how much you don't have control over. Because a lot of what we talk about, and this is something that I think is so important as part of the core message that I'm really trying to get across, is that so many of the things that we put pressure on ourselves to fix or to feel like we're failing is by design. And it's not actually that we are failing, it's that the system is broken. So with that, my only last recommendation for you is to do your magic. As you all know, it's so important to be able to get the message out to additional people within the food system space. There's so many of you out there who are doing incredible work within your communities, and I want to be able to lift those messages up. The more that you're able to share this message with folks within your community, the greater that the Mezclala family grows, and the more influence that we can have on shifting these systems. So whatever your platform says, follow, like, subscribe, share. You do your magic, and we will do ours to keep bringing you great content every single month. Now let's get into this episode. I'm sitting across from Matt Biggar in digital space today. He has his PhD and is the principal and founder of Connected to Place, a strategy consulting firm that supports place-based collaboratives, nonprofits, and government agencies with facilitation, strategic planning, and advisory services. Matt focuses on systems change and strategic collaboration within local and regional contexts. He is an author and co-author of several published articles on human behavior, sustainability, systems change, and collective impact, and speaks regularly on these topics. Matt has a forthcoming book, Connected to Place, Regenerating Nature, Community, and Local Economies Through Systems Change. And prior to strategy consulting, Matt worked as a public school teacher and administrator for 17 years and conducted research at Stanford University. So welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Great. Thank you, Emily. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So let's dig into this. I love learning more about people's kind of upbringings and beginnings. And I want to hear more about what young Matt was like. Where did you grow up? How did those formative experiences shape who you are today?
Great. Yeah, I grew up in suburban Los Angeles County. It was a fairly stable, comfortable, and free range childhood. And when I think of free range, it meant I had a lot of time to spend time in a backyard, a wooded backyard. I spent time going around the neighborhood, playing with friends. I was able to bike most places on my old Schwinn bike. So there was a lot of good memories that way. Of course, I did school and a lot of other stuff as well. But the other thing I really remember too is like the role of cars, where that's the only way we got outside of our immediate neighborhood was in a car. And I didn't have any idea that there was public transportation or other modes to go beyond the neighborhood. And there wasn't much in LA at the time. But one thing that struck me from all those cars that really dominated the LA landscape was the polluted air. And so I had a job in high school that had me outdoors during the weekends. And I remember almost every time coming home having trouble breathing, I'd have to lay on the floor and just kind of get the bad air out of my lungs. So it really had a profound impact on me. So I had these kind of mixed experiences growing up, and both kind of positive and negative with the environment. And those things stayed with me. And then after college, had the privilege of going for a semester in the wilderness program. And that's where I really just grew this deep resonance with nature and kind of this felt awareness of all the harm that's happening to nature. So pretty much that's been my motivation and interest ever since. Even when I worked in public schools, I did a lot with environmental education, and with my consulting practice and research, a lot of it is about how we can live better in balance with nature.
That sounds so intense. The air quality affecting your health so much. I can't really imagine that. Even myself, throughout this would have been my early years in college, I worked as a housekeeper. And it was one of these things where you just kind of took, I don't know, like OSHA standards for granted, or you didn't follow them because of the expectations around the other people that were working there, where, the concentration of the chemicals that were used to clean the rooms wasn't strong enough to actually get rid of the stuff. And so then we'd take the bottles and then we'd fill it up with a concentrate ourselves instead of these pre-made systems. And I remember I was one of the only people that wanted to wear a mask in those situations. Everybody else was just going gung ho, like spraying all of this stuff around. And it's, man, this stuff could, in a long term way, like really affect your health. So I think that those experiences too, kind of like how that stuck with you. I feel like that piece of worker and employment safety and just being in a place where you can truly breathe fresh, clean air is something that I highly value as an adult.
It's definitely, yeah, I know. I mean, it's a right. It should be a right. And there's examples of people, across the world, particularly in lower income communities, who are disproportionately affected by these pollution burdens. And I think something like a lot around the lines of 9 million people worldwide or die from air pollution still in today's world. So we still have a long way to go to clean those things up.
Wow. Yeah, that's rough. I want to ask this question. It's a big one, but what do you think is your mission in life and who are you here to serve?
Yeah, no, I love the question. I love how you framed it. Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, and it kind of goes back to what I said about my upbringing and my value generation, about serving nature, but it's also about serving as things have progressed with my awareness and what I've worked on, serving local communities and local economies. That's really where my passion and focus has gone. And just my awareness we talked about the harm to nature, but there's been a lot of decline in community life. It's pretty well documented now, and local economies and local businesses have really struggled with how the globalized economy has gone. So those are kind of the things, and that's as you read the title of my book earlier, the subtitle being regenerating nature, community, and local economies. That's definitely kind of become the mission of my career. And I work in support of other people. I'm really fortunate to work with nonprofits and local government and foundations and groups that want to work together to make their places better, to make their community stronger, local nature better, to build up that local economic base, like I mentioned. And so a lot of my work is about how do we not just pull folks together to make change, but how do we do it in a strategic way that's going to ultimately have impact, not just on the margins, but and that's how I kind of have gotten into systems change over the years. It's let's think about not just intervention or a change here or there, but in my research of people doing just that in the food system, as we'll talk about in other areas. I will say I'm not too Pollyannish about it either. The forces that stand in the way are very powerful. And we're talking basically concentrated corporate power that have kind of locked a lot of our systems into place. We can talk about systems change in relation to that, but I think a lot of my work is rather than taking on those powerful forces, national, federal forces, it's a little bit more grassroots. Like how can we really build a new model in our localities and our regions to make better, to take on our biggest challenges. So that's become a lot of my mission, and I'm here to serve people on that journey.
I think that there has been no better time than now for you to be doing this work. And it's really interesting to think about the parallels that I see and just maybe what I hear and what you're talking about. And I spend a lot of time in the spirituality space and woo. I listen to a ton of tarot reading videos, and it's so interesting because people who aren't really in that space, they may not hear over and over again like I do. They're like, oh, the Aquarian age. We're in this time when the stars are aligning in a certain way where basically like all of these old systems are about to crumble. And we're in this transition in like nature's history and human history in which people are going to have to rebuild, but it's going to be on a different foundation, and that the future of business looks very different as a result. And it's just super interesting because I feel like there's going to be so many people that are looking for you, right? And this kind of approach towards, yeah, it's a deeper sense of intention. It's not just, oh, I'm the host or, oh, I'm the facilitator to bring people together, but it's like, why am I inviting these people? What specifically are the questions that I'm going to ask that's going to get them to think about change in a different way? And I feel like that's that lens and being able to call out things so explicitly, I think is being able to call out things so explicitly, I think is really important.
We want to learn more from you about the spiritual basis for this. I certainly connect to that in many ways, but right, I'm coming at it from a different angle, but it's great that it's going there. And I think there is this yearning for, and we'll talk about it, I know, like connectedness. I think that's what I see a lot, and that's opening up possibilities.
I'm going to take just 60 seconds of your time to let you know that from now until December 31st, I'm offering podcast listeners a special promotion for a 3-day intensive course that starts in January. It's an online course I offered last year that was very successful. We've moved beyond the beta phase and are offering it again in both English and Spanish for those looking to access land and capital for their first farm. That's right, instead of the full price of $250 for this 3-day intensive course that combines practical strategies for funding with behavioral psychology and AI tools, you get it for an incredible price, just $150. Remember, this offer is only available until December 31st. You'll find all the details in the show notes for this episode. All right, let's get back to the interview. Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a few themes, these topics that are really important for my audience: this human behavior, systems change, collective impact. Within the farming community, we may not necessarily use the same terminology, but we're talking about the same thing. And I'm just so curious to know, why is behavioral change so hard? This is something we talk a lot about on this podcast in particular.
I think there's different dimensions of behavior change. I'll start like talking more about like the consumer end of it, but there's also, of course, the farming and supply side of it that we can talk about as well. That no question, changing human behavior. It's a lot of people just say, let's stay away from it. Don't go there. We have to figure out other solutions. People will never stop driving cars as much. You just got to keep electrifying and changing them. And I think I think we give up a little too easily on that, because it's not a simple change. There's not a magic bullet or anything like that. But when I went back to do research, and I have to kind of go into this a little bit before I can circle back to some of the concepts. I was kind of mid-career. I'd been working in schools for 17 years, and I was just that thirst for, I've got to start to focus. Climate change was really taking center stage in terms of our discussions nationally and otherwise. What can I do more? And so I decided to research transportation behavior as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, at least here in California, certainly in the United States. And my question became, what are the conditions that we need to change our transportation choices to move from a less car-centric approach? Through a series of different studies, I started to really understand that it has very little to do with educational awareness and being concerned about climate change and being concerned about the environment. And it was a little hard to take at first because I'm an educator and I thought if we could just build more awareness, we can start making better choices. But it had much more to do with the physical context for people's lives, the social and cultural context around different behaviors, and not just the presence of those, but also how it kind of interacted with people's lived experiences, right? And so again, these just sticking in transportation, if things were relatively available, a train service or a biking infrastructure, something like that. It was what happened when those things worked well, where people started to connect to other people and that experience. Even nature, like just walking, being able to walk a little bit and experience nature. All these things were actually really important to people. Cost still mattered, but not as much. And even convenience. I mean, people were willing to take a little longer to get somewhere if they could have this kind of experience of connection. Just like transportation, when it comes to food choices, the context matters a lot, right? What's physically available? Is local and regional food even available to us? What is culturally and socially supported? What are like the norms out there? How are people choosing to source their food and eat their food and so forth? So to change that context has become my focus. So I kind of did that deep dive into understanding that, and then this led to systems change. And I'll just kind of outline that, and then maybe I'm happy to dive into the details for any of these a little bit more. But essentially, across the food system, transportation system, all the systems featured in my book, I'm kind of flipping the playbook of corporate capitalism, how corporate entities develop so much control over these systems. One is through land use. The other is through kind of just raw economic and political power. The other is through having control and influence over the culture and the narratives that are out there. And then finally, it's just kind of silos, just keeping things siloed so we can't develop bigger solutions very easily. And this is by design. This is how we stay kind of hooked on cars and consumer goods and digital society and so forth. So getting to that is, so we need to figure out how we can transform land use, how we can shift power, how we can reset culture, how we can break down silos to move a system in a different direction. And we talk a lot about those. I'm happy to dive into any of those a little bit further.
Yeah, let's do it because I know people listening want to hear more about the food systems piece.
Yeah, so to start with the land use piece, I think we've been led to believe that like this local regional food production is just not possible, that we have to have this global system where crops are commodities and you get things from everywhere. And that's just the way it is to feed this large population on our planet. But there's a lot of research that would show otherwise. It's research that needs to be out more in the public eye. But one I cite quite a bit is a 2020 study by some Tufts and Cornell researchers. They studied 378 metropolitan areas across the US, and they found that almost half of them, like right now with their existing agricultural land, and with a diet, we've talked about like the diet piece, but with a diet that was a little more plant-based than the typical American diet, that these over half, almost 180 metropolitan areas have enough, could produce enough to be for all the people who live within those regions. And in this, they specifically found that within 155-mile radius was that. So we're not talking like across a state necessarily, unless it's a small state. And so the point is where the land can be found and more land can be developed. I mean, this doesn't even necessarily count for urban farms and rooftop farms and those sort of things that can happen to produce even more food. And a really encouraging example of this is kind of goes back to post-World War II in Europe. In Copenhagen developed what was called the finger plan. And that essentially the fingers are the transit corridors that take out to the suburbs. So there's a transportation aspect to it, but what's in between the fingers is what matters for the food system, which is largely protected land for green space and agricultural land. And as a consequence, Denmark, which is a small country, right? So it's maybe comparable in population and geography to a large US metro area. produces 3 times as much food as its people needs. They just were very intentional about that land use nearby, and we can certainly can shift to those sort of things. And there's groups in the United States that are working on that. There's Food Solutions New England, which is a collaborative, and their big goal is to move in New England from 10% of food being produced and consumed in their region to 35%. And then this is in an area that was actually considered more of a challenge for regional self-production. And then it's kind of happening at more local levels. What's happening in Detroit with over 1,500 urban farms that have been developed there and not too short in a pretty quick time shows just the transformation that can happen. It's definitely possible. So then I'll give an example of each of the other levers and we can dive into other stuff. But so that's like the transforming land use. So it's more regionally and locally operated and is one thing, but so the power is very related to that. How do we shift power to more local and regional farmers? And I think it's really hard in the current system where farmers and ranchers, especially local ones, are so squeezed. They're selling to some corporate entity that sells to another corporate entity, and each level of the system is dominated by sometimes just a handful of corporations, whether it's the seeds and the fertilizer, like the inputs, or whether it's transportation or distribution and so forth. So trying to create situations in regions where farmers can work together and build power together, right? So share services, share marketing, sales, packaging, distribution, all these sort of things to bring down cost and also really connect to a certain marketplace. And there's a good example in Northern California here. It's called the Capay Valley Farm Shop, and they support 40 sustainable farms doing what I just said. There's also like land trust organizations. There's another one not north of here, Marin Agricultural Land Trust, and they do a lot to like collective land management. So I think there's power in local farmers really working together. And of course, there's going to be some competition, but trying to find ways to bring down cost and to kind of capture a market can happen. Also, a really big lever for shifting power is local anchor institutions having buy only local or buy regional food products, right? So universities are doing that. Like the University of Kentucky is a good example. Hospitals, local government. So there's a lot of ways to like shift. Okay, we're going to be, as a large consumer of food, we are going to shift to local and regional production. And just, yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot in terms of just what's happened with Black farmers historically and the loss of land ownership. And there's some good work like through the Detroit Black Farmer Land Fund to create more ownership opportunities for farms as well. So there's these multiple dimensions of power, and I document them all in my book. I'll shift and kind of won't spend quite as much time on like culture. But again, we're talking from like the consumer standpoint, right? I've already kind of alluded to the shift to plant-based diets just dramatically decreases the amount of land that's needed, obviously, to grow all the feedstock and to raise livestock and so forth. And so it makes it much more possible to be more reliant on local and regional. And there's lots of great interventions that have started to take hold, like Meatless Mondays, which is just institutions adopt. Like cities they'll say we're going to have meatless Mondays, and they're not going to in their food facilities, cafeterias, their meeting events and so forth. It's going to be all plant-based. So that's one important part of kind of reducing demand for land for food, so it doesn't have to be so globalized. And then the other piece is definitely reducing food waste. We know what a huge problem that is, particularly in like affluent areas where food is wasted at the restaurants, groceries, and households. And so just having zero waste programs at schools is a great way to really start that culture of like, we're not going to waste food. The little bit we can't eat, we're going to compost. So that stuff can also be really important. And then on the supply side, and it's a lot of work that I know you do as well, and certainly cultural shift is providing a lot of training and education and support for farmers and helping access financing, helping find workers, whatever it may be. It's not an easy thing to do. And since our system has not been supporting that, we have to really bring that back. And then the final lever of breaking down silos, right? So this is true for all the different systems that I have in my book, but like for food, It's just trying to find opportunities to bridge local regional food production with other systems. So with the energy system, for example, there's farms will take on maybe some solar panels or maybe some wind turbines, and that's some supplemental income, which is very valuable, especially in a bad year for crops. But it's also building up local and regional energy production, which is valuable in terms of connection to place and sustainability. So that nature spaces can blend with spaces, like in foodscapes in different cities, and new housing developments taking on community gardens is another thing I document. So that's just a way to bring forces together. So in summary, to giving those examples, the food system is going to it's going to be really hard to change it, as true of others, if all these things aren't working in the same direction. So if we just transform land use, that's not necessarily going to we need to also be shifting power, resetting culture, breaking down silos. And when those are all moving in the same direction, that's when we get powerful change.
I'm so curious to know because I've looked at some of this stuff around behavioral change, but I would be curious, based on your experience and your research, do you feel like people are more likely to change when they are forced to or when they are personally motivated to change?
Oh, good question. I'm also going to say neither, in a sense. I guess I'm leaning towards the forced to, right? I definitely would say, I mean, personal motivation, lots of research, my own included. It's just almost never enough to change behavior. I mean, I think we just kind of, because we feel like the systems dominate our lives. I mean, I have a lot of motivation to live lightly and to make sustainable choices. I don't always do that because the conditions don't support it. So when I said I lean towards the force, I lean towards conditions forcing us to go in that direction, right? And so, I mean, I'll go to transportation to give you an example of really one of the most powerful changes I was able to document. It's specifically more to transportation, but it's broader. In Paris, and you may have heard of this, in the last 10 years, they've just completely transformed transportation in the city core. And so, and they've added amazing amount of miles, 800 miles of bike lanes, removed 50,000 parking spaces, which you can imagine like the potential backlash of that, right? They've opened up what they call them open streets, 100 open streets, which mean they are open to pedestrians and biking and rolling and community gathering, and they're closed to cars, right? And so this happened within a 10 years. And there was a grassroots advocates coming together, building power. There was a mayor who was supportive and got reelected even when this was well underway. And so there's like definitely a shift of power that was taking place. Culture was being reset in a lot of different ways, like through bike share stations and bike parking that were pervasive. And so those kind of send this message that it's really valued for you to bike here. And then, of course, yeah, the land use changes. I mean, there's the bike lane. Well, I already kind of went through that, but there's also things like repurposing streets to be 2/3 for getting people around, 2/3 cement paved, but 1/3 nature, right? And so making a very attractive spaces to be in and potential for food even. In fact, Paris has a great local agricultural program where they've just expanded a lot of local food. They have the largest rooftop farm, 3.5 acres in Europe, and they've supported the training for farmers and stuff. So I'm kind of going in that tangent, but just focusing on the transportation piece. Now, 3 times as many people bike in the city center than drive cars. Like it's just this unbelievable change that's happened. And they've actually recently passed another ballot to continue to add 500 more open streets, to remove more parking to make it possible. Very focused around like safety around schools, around every neighborhood having 5 to 8 pedestrianized streets. So this is like this tipping point that's been reached. And I'd say it's because there are all these different systems change levers kind of came together. And I kind of glossed over, but that breaking down silo piece is important. It wasn't just let's create transportation change, let's create more bikes, but it was nature spaces, food spaces, like the 15-minute city, and supporting local business access and those sort of things. So yes, so to the long answer to your question is if I just use the example of Paris, people are biking there. I think it appealed to them and maybe they wanted to, but the conditions had to support it. And that's what's changing there.
Exactly. Yeah. That piece of it's not just the one thing. And I feel like that's something that when I've talked about behavioral change or habit building or habit breaking on the podcast before, a lot of it has to do with this kind of compounding effect. And this idea that it's not just the one and done, right? Like culture and systems change comes from this compounded kind of what you're talking about, right? Like shift. And I think that it's hard sometimes for people to imagine themselves as part of something that's bigger, right? Or a movement, and that just their desire to reduce the amount of water that they're using, for example, is going to make a difference. I know that from my experience of having, moved to Mexico at the beginning of this year and just being so shocked by the lack of infrastructure for recycling and reducing food waste. It was wild to me because I was taken out of my comfort zone and things that I had become accustomed to in terms of waste management and water conservation and the systems, for example, in the apartment that I live in, it's a solar water heater. So if it's gray for 3 days in a row, you are not going to get hot showers. And they're like things that we just take for granted. And so, depending on where you're at in the world, I think that people's level of optimism and hope can vary quite a bit. I know that when I got here, I questioned my ability to have impact and influence because the systems, the infrastructure that operates at a municipal level in the place where I'm currently at and across lots of parts of Mexico, it's just not there. And so I think that it's important what you're sharing because no matter where you find yourself in the world, listening to this podcast episode, being able to find case studies and examples of places where this is working. That is one extra tool that you can put in your pocket, right? In your toolbox so that when it comes time to advocating, talking to other people about this concept who are maybe naysayers or they're really negative about this idea of, hey, it's been done before, so it can be done again. And maybe in our local context, it looks different, but it doesn't mean just because our current system isn't there, doesn't mean it's not worth trying. And I think that's something that I really want folks to take away from our conversation today is no matter where you start, doesn't matter, but starting is the most important thing that you can do. And even if it's something that, like, I think a lot about this, even if I don't necessarily accomplish what I want to in terms of systems change in this lifetime, I get to keep working on it in the next body, right? That I inhabit. I'm a firm believer in reincarnation and this idea that my time's not up, right? When I pass on to the next life, like I just get to have a different body and keep working at it. And so in that way, it's okay. Well, let's just see what I can do in this body in this lifetime, and that will be enough.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a healthy way to approach things. And yes, I feel kind of overwhelmed by the state of things often. And I think where I get my comfort and is just kind of what you just said is that the best I can do is put ripples out and make change where I can and support change where I can. I'm not, I don't feel terribly optimistic about where things are headed right now, but I know things will last. The only thing that lasts beyond my own life is any impact I may have had. And that it's not nothing that I accumulated necessarily. It's just how do we relate to others? How do we relate to our systems? And that's where I get encouraged, meeting people like yourself and others who really are kind of taking that on. And you mentioned like doing like a small thing. And the thing I always kind of add to that piece is it's really you can do small things that help change systems, because if your mindset is a systems mindset, which is okay, am I what I'm doing, is it moving power, is it shifting power in any way, is it helping change culture in any way, is it helping change land use, am I breaking down silos? If you're doing those things in any one of them, you are actually helping do that. And it comes like your description of being in Mexico and the changed context for recycling and other things is kind of like a classic example of the personal piece and the friction there. And like I said, there's a lot of things I can do here that are connected and maybe have less of an environmental impact because they're fairly easy to do, or they're not crazy to do, right? And
Exactly.
it's really hard when it doesn't feel possible at all, but we can start to change those things.
Well, and this is the thing too, because I noticed as soon as I didn't real or as soon as I realized that there was no place for me to bring my recyclables. Well, first of all, I found through a group chat that there was a local company that offers like curbside composting service. So I signed up for that right away. I got my landlord in it too. So I have my bucket in my kitchen. My landlord has a bucket and downstairs in her kitchen as well. And so they'll pick it up once a week, and that's been great. But the other piece is that I am so much more mindful of the things that I purchase when I'm grocery shopping, thinking about the packaging that it's coming in. Am I buying a glass bottle or am I buying a like aluminum can? And I always go for the glass bottles. The reason is that I'm reusing them for when I make my weekly chai or when I brew a batch of kombucha. And then whenever am invited to a friend's place, like I'll always bring a jar of something with me. Right. And then I'm also now the person that's like, I used to make fun of my grandma for this. And now I'm like, oh my God, I'm that person. Where I wash my Ziploc bags because there isn't the separate bin to be able to put that in. And so I found that, and this was a challenge actually, I was very inspired by my sister when I went to go visit her in Australia last year. She shared with me, she was like, this box of Ziploc bags I've had for almost 1 year because she was doing the same thing. Why is it that growing up that was not cool? Because to me, now as an older person, a young adult, I actually think that's a really impressive story. And I know a lot of us growing up, we would watch those Netflix shows or maybe the blog about, oh, I'm going to reduce my waste over the next 365 days. And it's like this personal challenge that they take on. And they talk about how the only thing that I'm going to have will fit in this small box. And here are all of the things that I had to do in order to get to that point. I think those stories are so cool. And a lot of times, those changes behaviorally weren't predicated by necessity, it was desire. And so it's really interesting to think about that of, this push and pull of what is the system controlling that I do? How am I just responding to what's happening? But then also, where am I personally motivated to just do this thing, whether it's because I think it's cool or because I just need to do it.
I love it. So many things come to mind as you talked about that. I mean, one, that you had some cultural cues, like the Netflix special early in your life that kind of made it look like, oh, this is something people can do. It's something kind of cool. And that stuck with you. But I also think you're an outlier in a very positive sense, right? When there isn't an immediate context that supports something, it's really hard, and for a lot of people, even if they might have had some connection with it before. But it's so important that you and me and all others who are really on this path of trying to heal our relationship with nature and our relationship with communities, that we're like leading by example as much as we can, and not preaching, just doing, right? Just you're at a social gathering and you just maybe make a little more effort to, if there's a compost option, or not to leave a lot of waste on a food plate or something like that. You're just sending these messages, and that's where personal change and systems change overlap. Okay. And I think we always, we have to push back a lot. Well, what one person doesn't matter. And that's true in a mathematical sense, right? The actual impact, but it's not true in terms of changing the zeitgeist, changing how people feel about things. And I just feel like the more, and I mean, that is the final chapter in my book, is just to say we're not going to get very far with systems change if we're rowing in the other direction. If we're just we've got to move in that direction. As many of us who are ready can. And so I love that you're making it happen, even when it's not that easy.
Definitely. Yes, we try little by little where we can. One of the things that I love to leave listeners with are practical tools, habits, resources that they can sort of put into action right away. And I have a feeling that there's a lot of people that, they're listening, they're probably in a same position as you where they're feeling overwhelmed, right? And disheartened by some of maybe what they're seeing in the news and not necessarily knowing like where do they start. And so I'm curious, what is maybe one tool, practice, habit, strategy that you could recommend for them?
Right. Yeah, I alluded to some, and I'll just kind of reiterate and dive into it a little more. Is definitely using what I would most offer is using a systems lens to your work and thinking about that in your local regional network, right? So I'm assuming, I mean, I'm speaking to folks who want to build better places, who want to build strong local regional food production systems, who want places to be where the people can really come together and celebrate local food and of course purchase it and support local farms, but it just becomes something that is so important. And that does feel overwhelming because if you're in most places that it, where food's coming from all over the place, you're walking into the market and it's like a pasta. I always am struck by some things like pasta from Italy, which of course that's the best pasta in our minds from the narrative, but I'm sure we can make pasta locally. And of course there are great pasta, local pasta, but for some reason it's still, we got to get it from everywhere, all over the place. And so my point in kind of going that way is it can kind of feel like overwhelming, like how in the world do I change this? But for, I guess, the systems piece, first of all, you're building a new model, right? You're not necessarily taking on the powers, the large corporations directly, although we do need things at the federal level to help with that. And so then it's like sinking into what's my skill set? What am I most inclined to do from a systems perspective? Am I more of a cultural person? Am I more of like an educator, encourager? I want to change social practices, kind of like some of the stuff you just described. Then maybe I want to lean into that a little bit. Or am I more of like a power person? Now, do I want to bring people together to build power and both market and political power and maybe influence a local government, maybe state government to make some change? Or am I more just like I'm like a land use person where I want to help, and it does, these things all intersect, right? But do I want to make sure that we are capturing space, vacant spaces for farmland, that we are protecting the urban growth boundaries so we can have a farm agricultural green belt around our cities, around our metropolitan areas. And so you kind of sink into like, where am I? And then within those are very large categories. It can be like on the cultural front, it might just be, I really want to focus on plant-based diets and how we can move people in that direction. Or maybe it's more like the farmer training, like I mentioned. So I think that part is important, but you still may feel like, well, I'm doing this part, but you know, what about the rest? And that's where it's so important, like strategic collaboration, connecting to other people who can complement those skills so you can start to build something more powerful together. And again, it really does need to have all four levers moving in that direction for any real lasting change to happen. So yes, it's just connecting the small things you do to the bigger picture of systems change, locking into where you feel like you can make the most difference, and connecting to others. Connecting to others, so important.
Absolutely. There's 1,000 ideas coming to my mind about how people could leverage the content of your book in the context of their existing work. So, like, I work with a ton of food systems professionals, whether that's at the local level, maybe it's with counties, or maybe with university extensions, or maybe they're working with departments of agriculture or other, maybe like state level, maybe in federal level agencies. And I can't help but think, like, how could I, for example, if I purchased a copy of your book as an ebook and then I were uploading it into ChatGPT and then analyzing it in the context of my current position, identifying like where are the opportunities for me to do what I'm doing differently, I think that would be so cool. So when your ebook is available, let us know. We'll include it in the show notes because I'm sure people will be really interested to get their hands on it. But I always wrap up episodes with this question because you are on the Transcendent Farmer podcast. What does it mean to you to be a transcendent farmer?
To me, a transcendent farmer is definitely someone who's deeply connected to the land and committed to taking care of it for the long term. And I'm so inspired by, in the process of researching my book, just farmers, ranchers that I've come across who really, that, and it's just so clear that's how they feel about things. And a lot of times they're just kind of hanging on and struggling in a system that does not necessarily support them, but they are transcending the system. They're also just kind of, what they're doing has a very deep meaning in their lives. And they're thinking about obviously the end consumer, but they're also thinking about all the other creatures who are on the land. And how do we not develop farms and ranches that pretty much wipe them all out just to produce food for humans? And of course, there's great examples about how ecosystems can be part of farms and still produce a lot of really rich harvest. I also think that, to go in the spirit of personal change, like we all, whether our profession is farming or not, we all can be a transcendent farmer in one way just by growing a little bit. I mean, I think that's such a huge part of the cultural change. Whether even if you're an apartment owner, just you maybe having a couple things inside of a window, like growing some herbs or something out on a small patio or porch. And I think the more we all kind of become part of that, the more we can all become transcendent farmers. And then we can also really appreciate how the rest of our food is coming into our house and being more connected to it. So I think the last part of transcendent farmers, in my ideal sense, they're not only connecting to the land and nature and supporting it, but they're also connecting to the communities. And I think of going to farmers markets. Sometimes it's like the family members, it's not who are there, but there's a really rich connection there. And that's what I hope that can become the dominant model once again. It certainly was for a long time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that so much. And I think that's really important what you emphasize is that it doesn't matter at what scale you are growing, just grow, right? Start with a single seed, even if that's all you have. I know in my tiny apartment space, that's what I'm working with is a balcony. And it's enough. I have some overflowing tomatoes that are about to make their way down to the first floor. I currently live on the third. And I didn't realize when I purchased them, they were an indeterminate variety. So that was a fun learning experience. But I'm sure that listeners are going to be really excited to go out and find out more about you. Go get a copy of the book that's on its way. I believe the pre-orders are available now. So where would you send folks in order to get more information?
Great. Yes. It's very easy to find my website. It's the same name as my book, which is connectedtoplace.com. It's all one word, connectedtoplace.com. And there, the link to my book is available. There's a 30% discount with a code that's on my website that you can use at the publisher, Cornell University Press. And I'm also available for presentations and workshops that are related to this. A big part of what I offer folks if they're curious.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations again on the book. I know it's a big deal. Not everyone gets to the point of actually publishing something. I've met a lot of people that have started, but they never finish, or they write 3 drafts and they throw them all away. I'm really excited that you're getting this out into the world and that we're going to be supporting you and sharing it with our community as well. So we'll make sure that all that information is in the show notes for folks to find out and follow along. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you for your time and the work that you are doing. I think it's so important. I think that this message around systems change and connection is something that we just can't hear enough.
I really appreciate the opportunity, enjoyed the conversation, and appreciate the work you're doing on food systems change.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening to another episode, and be sure to tune in soon for the next one.